Chapter 1. The Gray Bloom. The rain in Oakhaven wasn't born of clouds. It was born of the shadow. Not a black, suffocating darkness, but a gray, viscous thing that clung to everything: the slate roofs of the houses, the warped timbers of the mill, the threadbare wool of the villagers' garments. It settled in the lungs, a damp chill that whispered of forgotten sorrows and the certainty of decay. For 50 years, Oakhaven had been steeped in this gray bloom, a testament to the dominion of the Oni of the Red Crag. The crag itself was a jagged wound in the northern face of the mountains, a place where the wind howled with an unnatural rage, and the very stones seemed to writhe. Legend painted the Oni as remnants of a forgotten god, warped and vengeful, demanding a tribute from the valley, not of sustenance, but of life. The pattern was chillingly consistent: a single piercing scream at dusk, followed by the brutal, silent disappearance of a villager, a single blackened footprint pressed into the damp earth. Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man built more of weary shoulders and regret than authority, had spent the last decade attempting to track the Oni, a fruitless endeavor punctuated by the grim ritual of burying the dead. Had tried diplomacy, offering trinkets, silencing rumors, but the Oni were immune to pleas, fueled only by a hunger that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. His investigations, conducted with a dwindling supply of hope and a heavier heart, had led him to the edge of despair. The rain intensified, drumming a mournful rhythm on the warped tin roof of his office. It smelled of wet stone and something else, something acrid, vaguely metallic, clinging to the air like a phantom scent. Thorne shifted in his worn leather chair, the dampness already seeping through his threadbare coat. Had been staring at the rain, lost in the monotonous contemplation of a life consumed by failure, when the scream tore through the oppressive quiet. It wasn't a prolonged wail, the kind that hinted at agonizing suffering. It was a sudden, sharp, choked sound, abruptly cut short. Thorne swore, a low rumble born of decades of suppressed frustration. He grabbed his rusty revolver, the metal cold and slick against his palm, and moved with deliberate, almost mechanical efficiency. Head had grown accustomed to this sound, a predictable herald of the inevitable. The trail led him, predictably, to the outskirts of the village, to the lower reaches of the forest that pressed against Oakhaven like a malevolent hand. The rain here was thicker, laced with the same gray mist, and the air vibrated with a palpable tension. He found the body already: Thomas Miller, the baker, sprawled in the mud, his face contorted in a silent scream. The mark was there, as always, a single, perfectly formed footprint, imprinted with an oily darkness that seemed to absorb the light. Thorne knelt, his joints protesting with a chorus of clicks and groans. He didn't touch the body, didn't attempt to gather evidence. What was the point? The Oni wouldn't leave anything behind. He simply observed, a grim and practiced ritual, noting the precise angle of the footprint, the disturbed earth, the lingering scent of metal. As he rose, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a villager, not entirely. A man, clad in worn, travel-stained armor, more rust than silk, as the locals would inevitably say, stood motionless, his back to the rain. He wasn't visibly armed, but there was a stillness about him, an almost unnerving sense of control. "You," Thorne said, his voice roughened by years of shouting over the wind, "you're interfering." The man turned. He was tall, lean, with a face etched with 1,000 unspoken battles. His eyes, a startling shade of gray, held an ancient weariness. He didn't speak, didn't offer an explanation. He simply observed Thorne with a quiet intensity that felt unnervingly perceptive. "Name's Kenji," he said finally, his voice a low rasp, like stone grinding against stone. "I heard a scream. Figured someone needed a hand." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the scene, encompassing the rain-soaked ground, the fallen body, the oppressive gray mist. This place, it reeks of desperation. Thorn studied him, assessing the newcomer. He was a skilled warrior, that was evident. The armor, though weathered, was well maintained, and there was a quiet confidence about him that suggested a lifetime spent in conflict. But something else was there too, a profound melancholy, a sense of having carried the weight of the world for far too long. "You're a Ronin?" Thorn asked, a flicker of something akin to reluctant respect in his eyes. Kenji nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "A wandering blade," he corrected, "seeking a worthy purpose." Chapter 2. Echoes in the Mist. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the slate roofs of Oakhaven, a mournful counterpoint to the unnerving quiet that still clung to the village. Thorn, his assessment of Kenji complete, remained rooted to the edge of the square, a weathered sentinel observing the Ronin as he moved through the immediate aftermath of the attack. Kenji's actions hadn't been particularly dramatic, a swift, efficient dispatch of the remaining demonic hounds that had scattered after the shogun's fall, a careful examination of the wounded, a calming presence for the hysterical villagers huddled around flickering torches. Yet, Thorn felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a lessening of the suffocating dread that had permeated Oakhaven for decades. It was as if Kenji's arrival, a single deliberate act, had introduced a tiny fracture in the obsidian shell of the village's despair. "The locals call you Winter's Breath," Thorn stated, the words laced with a mixture of curiosity and something akin to a challenge. An apt name, considering the circumstances. Kenji didn't immediately respond. He was kneeling beside a young boy, no older than 10, whose leg had been torn by one of the Oni. The boy, pale and shivering, clung to Kenji's hand, his fear momentarily eclipsed by the Ronin's practiced calm. As Kenji finished bandaging the wound with strips torn from his own tunic, he looked up, his gray eyes meeting Thorn's with a disconcerting directness. "Names are fleeting things, Thorn," Kenji said, his voice a low rumble. "Titles hold little weight. Winter's Breath is simply a reflection of my blade, a reminder of the cold resolve required to meet darkness." Thorn considered this, the words sharp and deliberately chosen. Had spent his life dispensing judgments, shaping narratives with his voice, and Kenji's response was a jarring reminder of the brutal honesty inherent in a warrior's existence. "You seem burdened," Thorn finally observed, the statement not a question. Kenji paused, the movements of his hands freezing momentarily. The boy, sensing the shift in atmosphere, looked up at Kenji with wide, apprehensive eyes. "The weight of the world," Kenji continued, his gaze drifting back to the rain-slicked cobblestones, "is a familiar companion. It settles upon you, heavier with each battle, each loss." He didn't elaborate, and Thorn sensed a deliberate restraint. There was a history in Kenji's silence, a tapestry woven from unspoken pain. Thorn, hardened by years of mercenary work and haunted by the ghosts of battles past, understood that weight instinctively. It wasn't a burden born of circumstance, but of something deeply ingrained, something that seemed to cling to Kenji's very being. "You arrived because of a scream," Thorn prompted, breaking the tense quiet. "A predictable response for a warrior. But I sense something more than simple duty driving you." Kenji slowly rose, brushing dirt from his worn tunic. "The scream was the catalyst," he admitted, "but the desire for redemption, that is the deeper current. This place, this village, it is steeped in suffering. The honest touch has poisoned the very soil. I believe," he added, a flicker of something akin to grim determination in his eyes, "that there is a way to cleanse it." "And you believe you are the one to do it?" Thorn asked, his voice laced with a cautious skepticism. Kenji turned, his gaze fixed on the heart of the village, on the crumbling stone church that had witnessed generations of torment. I don't believe, he corrected, that I the one. I believe that I can be. The darkness feeds on despair, on the absence of hope. To fight it, one must offer something in its place, a beacon of defiance, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, light can still be found. He drew Winter's breath, the silver of the blade flashing momentarily in the gray light. This blade, it is a tool, yes, but it is also a symbol of the will to resist, the determination to prevail. Thorn watched Kenji, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather grip of his own sword. He recognized the lethal grace in the Ronin's movements, the effortless control, the chilling precision. He also recognized something else, a profound weariness, a sadness that seemed to bleed from the very metal of his blade. The Oni of the Red Crag, Kenji said, his voice barely a whisper, are not merely beasts. They are echoes, fragments of a forgotten darkness, sustained by the suffering of this land. To destroy them, one must sever the connection, not just the bodies. He sheathed Winter's breath with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound echoing in the rain-soaked silence. Tell me, Thorn, Kenji said, his gray eyes meeting Thorn's once more. What do you believe haunts Oakhaven? Thorn hesitated, a knot forming in his stomach. He knew instinctively that the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just demonic influence, it was something older, something woven into the very fabric of the village's history. And he realized, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that Kenji's arrival wasn't just about fighting a shadow. It was about confronting a truth that Oakhaven had desperately tried to bury. Chapter 3. The rain hadn't ceased. It was a persistent, insistent drizzle, clinging to the slate roofs of Oakhaven, slicking the cobblestones, and deepening the already oppressive gloom. Kenji remained by the fountain in the center of the square, his back to the crumbling stone wall, Winter's breath sheathed, but always within easy reach. Thorn, having spent the last hour observing the Ronin from the shadowed doorway of the Weaver's Guild, approached cautiously, the rhythmic drip of water the only sound accompanying their hesitant steps. You said they are echoes, Thorn began, his voice low and measured. Fragments of darkness. But what feeds them? What sustains the resentment that allows these Oni to manifest? Kenji didn't turn, merely continued to study the flow of water, as if deciphering a hidden current. Resentment is a fertile ground, Thorn, especially when layered with sorrow and forgotten deeds. This land has known much suffering. Generations of farmers bled into the soil, their spirits tethered to the failure of the harvest. The barons' tax collectors, ruthless and greedy, choked the village of its prosperity. And before them, the whispers of a massacre, hushed down by the church, a stain upon the names of Oakhaven's founding families. He finally turned, his face etched with an unreadable expression. The silver of Winter's breath momentarily illuminated the deep lines around his eyes, the scars that mapped a lifetime of violence and regret. The Oni aren't born from malice alone. They are born from the accumulated weight of that pain. They are drawn to it, feeding upon it, amplifying it until it manifests as something tangible. Thorn shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the implication. The villagers, he realized, weren't simply victims of demonic influence. They were complicit, in a way, through their own quiet acceptance of the village's darker history. He noticed, with a growing sense of unease, that several villagers were now watching them, faces hidden in the shadows of their doorways, their eyes like dark pools reflecting the rain-slicked stones. You spoke of a forgotten massacre, Thorn prompted carefully. Can you elaborate? Kenji hesitated, a flicker of something akin to pain crossing his features. Decades ago, a dispute arose between two prominent families, the Blackwoods and the Ashworths, over the rights to the Silverstream mine. It escalated quickly, fueled by accusations of treachery and whispers of poison. The dispute ended with a dozen men dead in the town square. The church declared it a divine judgment, a punishment for the family's sins. The Blackwoods were exiled, the Ashworths vanished, and the truth, the brutal, senseless violence was deliberately buried beneath layers of pious denial. He paused, letting the information sink in. The river, Silver Stream, is not merely water, Thorn. It carries with it the echoes of those deaths. The sorrow, the anger, the unacknowledged guilt, it's all interwoven into the very fabric of the land. Thorn felt a chill, not entirely from the rain. He understood now. Kenji wasn't simply fighting demonic manifestations, he was confronting the ghost of Oakhaven's own collective guilt. The Oni were a grotesque reflection of the village's darkest secret, given form by the accumulated weight of unspoken horrors. But how does that translate to the Oni? Thorn asked, grasping at a thread of logic. How do the Blackwoods and Ashworths influence these creatures? They don't influence them, Kenji corrected, his voice flat. Them. Their resentment, their rage, their desire for retribution, it becomes the fuel for the Unis existence. The Oni are fragments of those souls, warped and corrupted, seeking to complete the unfinished business of that tragic day. He drew Winter's breath, this time holding it aloft, the silver blade catching the light like a frozen tear. To truly defeat them, you must not only destroy their physical form, but also acknowledge the source of their power, the unresolved pain. He lowered the blade slowly, deliberately. This village has built a wall around its memories, Thorn. A wall of silence and deception. Breaking that wall, confronting the truth, that's where the real battle lies. He looked directly at Thorn, a piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through him. You are a historian, yes? You have spent your life studying the past. You understand the dangers of ignoring it. Thorn met his gaze, feeling a sudden, profound sense of vulnerability. He realized that Kenji wasn't merely a warrior, he was a reckoning, a catalyst sent to expose the rot that had festered beneath the surface of Oakhaven for centuries. I believe, Kenji said, his voice softening slightly, that the Oni will not disappear simply by destroying them. They will simply find new hosts, new vessels for their despair. The key is not annihilation, but resolution. To offer a sacrifice, not of life, but of acknowledgement. He turned and began to walk back towards the square, his movements silent and purposeful, disappearing into the deepening rain and the lengthening shadows. Thorn, left standing alone, felt a chilling certainty settle over him. Kenji's arrival wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a terrifying, inevitable beginning, steeped in the dark secrets of Oakhaven's past. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Stone. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the slate roofs of Oakhaven, a steady, mournful rhythm that seemed to amplify the silence Thorn now found so profoundly unsettling. Kenji was gone, vanished as quickly and completely as a winter storm, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and a prickling awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the village. Thorn, soaked to the bone and wrestling with a growing sense of unease, found himself drawn back to the square, compelled by an instinct he couldn't quite articulate. He found Elder Silas pacing beneath the skeletal branches of the oldest oak, the tree itself bearing the scars of countless past storms, and perhaps of something darker. Silas, a man usually a bastion of stoic calm, was agitated, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere exhaustion. He hadn't been offering thanks as Thorn had anticipated, but rather a stream of fragmented recollections, disjointed narratives of whispered legends and forgotten rituals. It wasn't just the shoguns, Silas rasped, his voice raw. There were offerings, for generations, not of gold, not of jewels, but of children. Small, quiet children, taken under the veil of the harvest moon. Thorn felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The accepted history of Oakhaven, meticulously documented and fiercely defended by the village's lineage of historians, himself included, had always painted a picture of pragmatic sacrifice, a necessary evil to appease the Oni and maintain the village's precarious existence. The truth, Kenji had implied, was buried beneath layers of deliberate obfuscation. The records were curated, Silas continued, his eyes clouded with shame. The village elders, the council, they built a fortress of silence to protect us from the horror, to prevent the despair from festering and spreading. They buried the evidence, altered the accounts. They called it preserving the peace. He gestured weakly towards a crumbling stone marker, a single, moss-covered headstone bearing the name Alara. Beloved daughter, one of the many unmarked graves discovered in the forgotten corners of the village cemetery during the recent demon attacks. This was Alara's grave. We've known for years, of course, but we didn't of it. We simply erased her, as if she never existed. The air thickened with unspoken guilt. Thorn understood now. Kenji hadn't simply arrived to slay demons, he had arrived to dismantle a carefully constructed lie. He hadn't offered a singular sacrifice, but demanded a reckoning, a full, painful acknowledgement of the darkness that had stained the heart of Oakhaven. Suddenly, a young boy, no older than 10, stumbled out of the shadows, clutching a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He was one of the few children who had remained in the village, spared from the honest attention by some unexplained circumstance. He stopped before Thorn, his face pale and drawn. "My grandfather told me a story," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "He said the Oni weren't just hungry for lives. They were hungry for names, for memories. They took our names, our stories, our very identities." He held up the wooden bird. "This was carved by my grandfather. He used to tell me that if you speak a child's name aloud, you can break the Oni's hold." The implication was stark and horrifying. The Oni hadn't merely consumed flesh and blood, they devoured the essence of Oakhaven's youth, feeding on their stolen futures. Thorn felt a sudden surge of anger, not at the demons themselves, but at the generations of men who had prioritized order over truth, who had prioritized survival over morality. He looked around at the faces gathered in the square, the grim-faced elders, the fearful villagers, the bewildered boy, and realized that Kenji had done more than just defeat a monster. He had ignited a flame of dissent, a desperate yearning for justice in a place built on centuries of deception. "We need to find the records," Thorn declared, his voice gaining strength. "Not just the official ones, but the personal ones. The diaries, the letters, the whispers passed down through generations. We need to reclaim those lost names, those stolen memories." Silas nodded slowly, a flicker of hope replacing the despair in his eyes. "It's a dangerous path, Thorn," he warned. "The council, they won't tolerate this. They'll try to silence you." "Then, well, silence them first," Thorn replied, the words laced with a quiet resolve. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Kenji hadn't simply left Oakhaven, he had left a battleground. A battle not against demons, but against the insidious forces of denial and corruption that had taken root in the very soul of the village. The rain continued to fall, washing away the mud and the grime, but it couldn't wash away the echoes of the past, nor could it erase the daunting task that lay ahead, the slow, agonizing process of unearthing the truth from the heart of Oakhaven's deepest shadows. Chapter 5. The Cartography of Memory. The rain had ceased by mid-morning, leaving Oakhaven draped in a melancholic gray. Thorn, Silas, and a small contingent of villagers, mostly young men and a few surprisingly resolute women, were already meticulously sifting through the cluttered archives of the village elder, Master Elmsworth. The air hung thick with the scent of mildew, parchment, and a faint, unsettling odor. Thorn couldn't quite place something akin to dried regret. Master Elmsworth, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weight of accumulated knowledge and quiet sorrow, watched them with an almost mournful patience. He hadn't offered any assistance, merely observed, a living monument to the silence he had once upheld. "The Council's records are curated," Thorn stated, carefully laying out a series of brittle water-stained scrolls detailing the village's history. "They focus on the protection of Oakhaven, of course. The rituals, the sacrifices, the appeasement of the Oni. They emphasize control, not explanation." Silas, his face still pale, but now with a discernible undercurrent of determination, was painstakingly copying passages from a smaller, leather-bound journal. "This is more promising. It's a personal account, penned by Elias Thorne, a distant relative of yours, I believe dating back to the reign of Lord Kalen. He describes anomalies, disturbances in the weather, livestock deaths, whispers of unsettling shadows before the Oni even began their open attacks. He speaks of the Crimson Debt, a concept deliberately obscured," Thorne continued, running a calloused finger over a particularly faded illustration of a stylized Oni. "The Council maintained that the sacrifices ensured the honest contentment, preventing their wrath. But Elias believed it was something far more complex, a payment for something stolen." A rising murmur rippled through the room as Thorne's words resonated. The villagers, previously hesitant and unsure, began to listen with a newfound intensity. They were starting to recognize that the demons weren't merely destructive forces, but a symptom of a deeper, more insidious corruption. Suddenly, a young man named Reese, a blacksmith's son known for his quiet demeanor, spoke up, his voice hesitant. "I remember my grandfather telling stories of a song of binding, a melody said to have been played during the initial sacrifices. He claimed it wasn't a plea for mercy, but a Thorne paused, his gaze sharpening. "A key to what?" Reese swallowed, his brow furrowed in concentration. "He said it unlocked something within the Oni, something ancient and hungry. That the Council feared the song, not the demons themselves." This revelation fueled a frantic search through the archives. They discovered fragmented accounts of a secretive order of priests, the keepers of the threshold, who had served the Council for centuries. These priests weren't simply performing rituals, they were, according to the records, actively manipulating the flow of spiritual energy, bolstering the honest power. As they delved deeper, a chilling pattern emerged. Every significant spike in the Oni attacks coincided with a specific ritual performed by the keepers. Rituals centered around the positioning of standing stones, scattered across the surrounding hills, stones now recognized as conduits for dark energies. The discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the archives, revealed by Silas' persistent probing of a loose floorboard, cemented their suspicions. Within, they found a collection of exquisitely crafted bone artifacts, meticulously arranged around a central pedestal, a stone tablet carved with unsettling geometric patterns. The air here thrummed with a tangible sense of dread. "They weren't appeasing the Oni," Silas stated, his voice tight with a grim realization. "They were feeding it. They were actively cultivating this darkness." Suddenly, a shadow fell across the chamber doorway. Master Elmsworth, his face unreadable, stood there with a single ancient lute in his hands. "You seek the truth," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A dangerous pursuit. Some doors are best left unopened." Before Thorne could respond, a dozen men in the dark gray robes of the Council appeared, emerging silently from the shadows. They were heavily armed, their faces impassive and unsettlingly uniform. The Council had been watching, waiting. "The Council has determined that your investigations are disruptive," Councilor Marius, a man whose features seemed perpetually set in a disapproving frown, announced. his voice smooth and chillingly polite. "We urge you to cease your activities and return to your mundane lives. The safety of Oakhaven depends on it." Thorn met Marius' gaze, a flicker of steel in his eyes. "The safety of Oakhaven depends on knowing what you've hidden for centuries. And we intend to find out." The battleground Kenji had left behind wasn't just against demons. It was against the suffocating weight of a truth buried beneath generations of lies. A truth he now knew he was irrevocably committed to unearthing, no matter the cost. The cartography of memory, he realized, was far more treacherous than any demon. Chapter 6: Echoes in the Stone. The air in the council chamber hung thick with the scent of aged parchment, and a subtle, unsettling musk of fragrance thorn, instinctively associated with suppressed secrets. The 12 figures of the council remained motionless, a silent, gray tide surrounding him. Marius' polite disapproval felt less like a warning and more like the measured pronouncements of a predator assessing its prey. Silas, ever the pragmatist, broke the oppressive stillness. "They're not going to simply let us walk away, Thorn. Their patience implies a deeper game. We've stumbled upon something significant, something they've actively shielded." He adjusted the heavy leather satchel containing Kenji's sworn katana, Winter's Breath, a constant, weighty reminder of the impossible task ahead. Master Elmsworth, still cradling the lute, offered no comment, his dark eyes fixed on Thorn with an unsettling intensity. The instrument seemed to absorb the light, radiating an aura of profound, unsettling age. Thorn wondered if the man understood the implications of their discovery, or if he simply possessed an awareness of the insidious nature of the darkness they were facing. "The Oni aren't merely feeding a demonic entity," Thorn began, his voice carefully measured. "They're sustaining a ritual, a cycle of sacrifice and corruption woven into the very fabric of Oakhaven. This isn't a localized demon infestation, it's a deliberate act of preservation." He shifted his weight, the worn leather of his boots scuffing against the flagstone floor, a small defiant sound in the vast echoing chamber. Counselor Marius shifted slightly, his expression unchanging. "Your theories are speculative. You are basing your conclusions on the actions of a lone Ronin and a village riddled with superstition. We operate on verifiable data, Thorn. Data collected over centuries of observation and meticulous control." "Control," Silas muttered, the word laced with bitter skepticism. "That's the key, isn't it? The council controls the narrative, the flow of information, the very perception of Oakhaven." Suddenly, the lute in Elmsworth's hands began to vibrate, a low, mournful hum that resonated through the chamber. The vibrations weren't violent, but insistent, weaving an unnerving melody that seemed to burrow directly into Thorn's mind. He felt a sharp, fleeting impression of vision of the village square. Centuries past, bathed in a sickly green light, a group of villagers chanting in a guttural tongue, and the unmistakable silhouette of the great horned shogun raising its monstrous club. The vision vanished as abruptly as it appeared, leaving Thorn breathless and disoriented. Elmsworth ceased playing, returning the lute to his side with an almost casual movement. "The lute," Thorn said, his voice hoarse. "It's a conduit, a focusing device for echoes, fragments of memories imprinted upon the land." Marius' eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of something akin to surprise crossing his face. "You believe this? You believe we are merely custodians of forgotten echoes?" "I believe we're suppressing a truth," Thorn corrected, his gaze sweeping across the council members. "A truth so potent, so corrosive, that it requires systematic erasure. The Oni, the sacrifices, the corruption, it's all a carefully constructed lie built to maintain their power." He gestured towards a heavy oak door at the far end of the chamber, a door reinforced with iron bands and sealed with a complex lock. "I suspect the key to understanding this lies behind that door. A repository of records, of rituals, of something far more unsettling. Without waiting for a response, Thorn moved towards the door. Silas and Elmsworth followed, their movements purposeful and silent. The council, however, did not pursue. Marius remained standing, a single, chilling statement hanging in the air. You will not find what you seek, Thorn. Some doors, as Master Elmsworth has warned, are best left unopened. The consequences of knowledge, particularly of this nature, are rarely benevolent. As Thorn wrestled with the lock, a mechanism of intricate gears and blackened steel, he felt a growing sense of unease. The chamber, once simply cold and oppressive, now felt actively hostile, as if the very stone itself was resisting their intrusion. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes that danced at the periphery of his vision. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the lock yielded. Thorn pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, descending staircase swallowed by absolute darkness. The air from within was frigid, carrying a faint metallic scent, the scent of old blood and something else, something ancient and profoundly unsettling. As he stepped across the threshold, Thorn turned back to face the council. Marius' lips curved into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. We trust you'll find what you're looking for, Thorn, though we sincerely doubt you'll like what you discover. The final words hung in the silence, heavier than the stone of the chamber itself. Thorn gripped Winter's breath a little tighter. The cold steel a small comfort in the face of the unimaginable darkness that awaited them below. The echoes of Oakhaven's forgotten past, he realized, weren't merely buried beneath the soil, they were actively guarding their secrets. Chapter 7. The Echo of Stone. The air below the staircase clung to Thorn like a shroud, thick with the residue of centuries' dust, decay, and something far more chilling regret. The metallic scent intensified, a ferrous tang overlaid with a subtle, almost floral sweetness that hinted at death long past. Winter's breath, a silver promise against the oppressive gloom, felt increasingly inadequate, a single blade against a tide of forgotten horrors. The descent was slow, each step measured, a deliberate rejection of the inherent disorientation of the space. The stone walls were slick with a moisture that felt unnatural, not the dampness of rain or earth, but something colder, more actively sentient. As they descended, the darkness resolved itself not into shifting shadows, but into pockets of absolute void, spaces where the light from Thorn's lantern seemed to actively disappear, as if devoured by the stone itself. The stairs terminated abruptly in a circular chamber, easily 30 feet in diameter. The ceiling vanished into impenetrable darkness, the lantern light struggling to penetrate the gloom. The walls were constructed from a dark, polished granite, inlaid with patterns of obsidian that seemed to writhe and shift in Thorn's peripheral vision. In the center of the room lay a dais, carved from the same stone, and upon it rested a single object, a perfectly preserved, scaled hand, clutching a tarnished silver amulet, shaped like a coiled serpent. Before they could fully process the scene, a sound echoed through the chamber, not a shout, not a growl, but a resonance, a vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. It built an intensity, a low thrumming that resonated deep within Thorn's bones, triggering a visceral unease he couldn't articulate. Remarkable, Marius' voice cut through the sound, a dry, scholarly observation that did little to soothe the growing dread. The architecture is remarkably consistent with the pre-cataclysm civilizations. They possessed a disturbing obsession with resonance, with manipulating the very fabric of reality through sonic vibration. Marius moved forward, examining the dais with a meticulousness that bordered on reverence. This wasn't merely a storage chamber, Thorn. It was a focus, a point of amplification. The demons of the Red Crag didn't simply. They were drawn here, nurtured here, by the power contained within this room. As he spoke, the resonant hum escalated, and the obsidian patterns on the walls began to glow with an internal, sickly green light. The hand on the dais pulsed faintly, and Thorn felt a prickling sensation across his skin, a sense of being observed, scrutinized by something ancient and profoundly alien. Suddenly, the air grew frigid, and a whisper brushed against Thorn's ear. Not in any discernible language, but a concept, a feeling of immense sorrow, an unending frustration. He instinctively reached for Winter's breath, his hand gripping the hilt with a desperate strength. "Don't react, Thorn," Marius cautioned, his voice sharp and precise. "This is a deliberate attempt to influence you, to feed on your fear. The stone is sentient. It remembers." As Thorn focused, he realized the whisper wasn't directed at him alone. It was a chorus of voices, layering upon each other, a cacophony of regret emanating from the stone itself. He began to perceive images, flashes of robed figures performing ritualistic acts, of arcane symbols etched into the walls, of a civilization consumed by its own ambition. "They were attempting to harness the energy of the void," Marius explained, his voice strained, "to tear a hole in reality. They succeeded, of course, but they didn't understand the consequences. They created a conduit, a doorway, and the demons were the inevitable byproduct." Then he noticed it. A subtle shift in the shadows near the back of the chamber, a darker density that wasn't merely the absence of light. From the inky blackness, a figure began to coalesce, vaguely humanoid in form, radiating an aura of profound sadness and malevolent intent. It wasn't a demon of the Red Crag, not precisely. It was a guardian, a shard of the civilization that had built this place, trapped and corrupted, forever bound to protect its secrets. "The wards are weakening," Marius said, his voice tight with urgency. "The serpent's eye is responding to the resonance." He gestured to the amulet on the dais. "We need to secure it. Now." As Thorn lunged forward, Winter's breath flashing in the emerald light, the guardian moved with unsettling speed, its touch a searing wave of cold. Thorn felt a debilitating pain in his arm, a burning sensation that threatened to overwhelm him. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. "It's feeding on your momentum," Marius shouted, firing a small, intricately designed device, a sonic disruptor at the guardian. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, disrupting the resonant hum, but it wasn't enough to dispel the creature entirely. The guardian solidified, its obsidian eyes burning with an ancient, sorrowful rage, a silent testament to a civilization's tragic fall. Thorn knew, with a chilling certainty, that they hadn't simply stumbled upon a secret, they had awakened something that would never truly sleep. Chapter 8. Echoes of obsidian. The air in the chamber thickened, not with mist, but with the residue of violence and a deeper, colder dread. Thorn's arm throbbed, a white-hot ache that threatened to consume his focus. Marius, a whirlwind of practiced efficiency, was meticulously examining the damage to the sonic disruptor, his brow furrowed in a grim concentration. The device, once a marvel of intricate engineering, was now scarred and sputtering, a testament to the Guardian's unnerving resilience. "The disruptor's harmonics are clearly tailored to its nature," Marius muttered, adjusting a delicate calibration. "It's not merely a beast, it's a memory, solidified. The serpent's eye isn't just amplifying the resonance, it's feeding it, allowing this thing to persist." The Guardian remained motionless, a statue of obsidian and sorrow. Its presence wasn't aggressive, not overtly, but radiated a profound, suffocating weight. Thorn shifted his weight, the leather of his worn armor creaking in the oppressive silence. The emerald light emanating from the serpent's eye pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, casting distorted shadows that danced with the Guardian's every subtle movement. He felt a creeping unease, a sense that they weren't fighting a creature, but confronting the echo of a lost empire. "We're losing time," Thorn said, his voice low and strained. "The wards, as Marius correctly identified, are failing. We need to understand." He turned his attention to the dais, examining the amulet, the serpent's eye, in detail. It wasn't overtly beautiful, but possessed a certain austere majesty. A single, perfectly formed ruby, the size of a raven's eye, pulsed with a disconcerting inner light, mirroring the rhythmic pulse of the emerald stone. He ran a gloved hand over its surface, a strange chill radiating through the leather. It felt ancient, imbued with a sorrow that resonated with the Guardian's rage. The texts mentioned a key of binding, Marius said, interrupting Thorn's contemplation. A device designed to maintain the wards, to suppress the resonance. It vanished during the collapse, alongside most of the city's records. And you believe this Guardian is somehow connected to its disappearance? Thorn asked, his hand instinctively drifting towards the hilt of Winter's breath. It's the only logical conclusion, Marius replied, his voice tight. The wards are not merely failing, they're being actively disrupted. The Guardian isn't just protecting the eye, it's attempting to return the city to its former state. Suddenly, a low groan echoed through the chamber, not from the Guardian, but from the stone itself. Cracks began to spiderweb across the walls, and the emerald light of the serpent's eye flared violently. Thorn recognized the sensation instantly, a backlash. The amulet was resisting the attempt to contain the resonance, amplifying the Guardian's power. The eye is becoming unstable, Marius shouted, frantically adjusting the controls on the remaining sonic disruptor. We need to stabilize it, or it'll shatter. As he spoke, the Guardian shifted. Not a fluid movement, but a slow, deliberate turning of its head, its obsidian eyes locking onto Thorn. For a fleeting moment, Thorn felt a jolt of something akin to recognition, a terrifying understanding that this creature wasn't just defending a secret, it was mourning a loss. Then, the Guardian attacked. Not with brute force, but with a precise, agonizing application of cold. This time, the touch wasn't a searing wave, but a creeping frost that seemed to penetrate directly into his bones. He cried out, staggering back, the pain radiating outwards, threatening to overwhelm him. He realized with sickening clarity that the Guardian wasn't attempting to kill him. It was attempting to add his own sorrow, his own memories, to its endless, desolate vigil. Marius unleashed a focused blast from the disruptor, a concentrated beam of oscillating energy that struck the Guardian squarely in the chest. The creature recoiled, momentarily disoriented, but the effect was short-lived. Its form began to solidify further, the obsidian surface reflecting the emerald light with an almost hypnotic intensity. It's adapting, Thorn yelled, drawing Winter's breath. The blade shimmered in the flickering light, the silvered steel radiating a faint, protective warmth. Don't let it feed on our fear. He lunged, aiming for a vulnerable point in the Guardian's armor, a seam where obsidian met a darker, almost porous material. The blade met resistance, a chilling dampness that quickly spread through his arm. But Thorn pressed on, his movements honed by years of brutal training, driven by a desperate need to break the creature's hold. The air filled with the rasp of steel against stone, the hum of the disruptor, and the mournful groan of the collapsing chamber. He knew with a chilling certainty that this was more than just a fight. It was a confrontation with a past that refused to remain buried, and he was caught in its unforgiving embrace. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Crag. The silence after Thorn's strike was more terrifying than the Guardian's earlier onslaught. It wasn't the chaotic reverberation of obsidian shattering against steel, but a profound, absolute stillness that pressed in on the group, thick with the scent of ozone and something ancient, something akin to petrified sorrow. The emerald light from the disruptor flickered, dying with a final pathetic sputter as Marius' power reserves drained. Kenji, who had observed the encounter from the shadowed doorway, moved with a deliberate grace that bordered on unsettling. He wasn't a man of hurried actions, but of measured assessment. His silvered katana, Winter's breath, remained motionless in his grip, its polished surface reflecting the remaining fragments of the collapsing chamber. "It doesn't fight back," he stated, his voice a low rasp that carried across the space. "It remembers." Thorn grunted, clutching his arm, the lingering cold still crawling beneath his skin. The dampness had begun to recede, but the sensation, a prickling awareness of being touched by something profoundly bleak, remained. "Remembering isn't a defense, Kenji. It's sustenance." Kenji approached the guardian cautiously, circling it like a predator sizing up its prey. The creature hadn't moved, hadn't attempted to strike. It's simply a monument of obsidian sorrow, its twisted horns scraping against the fractured ceiling. As he drew closer, a faint visual overlay flickered at the edges of his vision, fragmented images, a village consumed by flame, a young woman screaming, a single, blood-stained katana rising in the air. The memories weren't his. They were a torrent of someone else's anguish, layered upon layers, accumulating over centuries. "The Red Crag," Kenji murmured, his voice a breath lost in the echoing chamber. "They don't just claim lives. They claim the echoes of those lives." Marius, struggling to reboot the disruptor, looked up, his face pale and strained. How is this even possible? We're dealing with a demonic entity, not a psychic projection. "Demons aren't always defined by their intentions," Kenji said, turning the blade slowly, the silver light catching in its curve. "They are vessels. And this one is filled with the grief of 1,000 forgotten souls." He paused, considering the creature. "The Oni of the Red Crag don't just kill. They the weight of despair. They become the sorrow itself." Suddenly, a new wave of images flooded Thorn's senses, a younger version of himself, a boy barely old enough to wield a sword, witnessing his father's death during a brutal village raid. The visceral terror, the burning rage, the suffocating helplessness, it all coalesced, sharp and agonizing. He gasped, stumbling backward, instinctively raising Winter's breath. "Don't!" Kenji's voice cut through the chaos. "Resisting only strengthens it. You must acknowledge the pain, understand its source." Thorn, fighting against the overwhelming tide of the memories, struggled to control his movements. The Guardian's influence wasn't merely visual, it was a psychic assault, a direct invasion of his mind. He felt himself fraying at the edges, his resolve weakening with each passing moment. Kenji, with a precision born of years of disciplined combat, began a series of deliberate, almost ritualistic movements. He wasn't attacking the Guardian, but rather establishing a connection, a fragile, tenuous link born of respect and a shared understanding of suffering. He moved slowly, his katana tracing patterns in the air, a silent meditation against the onslaught. "It feeds on fear, yes," Kenji said, his voice calm amidst the rising panic. "But it also feeds on denial, on the unwillingness to confront the darkness within oneself." He then brought the blade down in a single, controlled stroke, not to wound, but to a particularly corrupted section of the obsidian surface. As the steel made contact, the visual overlay intensified, then abruptly shifted. Instead of fragments of pain, Kenji saw a clear, horrifying image himself, a young Ronin, standing before the Oni of the Red Crag, wielding Winter's breath, consumed by despair, ultimately succumbing to the creature's influence. "It isn't a projection," Kenji whispered, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "It's a prophecy." The Guardian shifted slightly, a low rumble echoing through the chamber. It wasn't an aggressive movement, but a subtle acknowledgement. The emerald light of the disruptor flickered again, and then, with a final exhausted sigh, died completely. The air hung heavy, charged with a palpable sense of acceptance. Kenji lowered his blade, the silvered light reflecting in his weary eyes. "The battle is not won," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "It is merely contained. The Red Crag will always seek to replenish its hunger. But now we know its weakness. It feeds on sorrow, and sorrow ultimately can be extinguished by empathy." He looked at Thorn, Marius, and the villagers huddled behind them, a ghost of a smile gracing his lips. "The true fight begins, not with steel, but with understanding." Chapter 10. Echoes of winter's breath. The air in Oakhaven had shifted, not just from the receding terror, but from something deeper, something unsettlingly thoughtful. The villagers, initially awed and hesitant, were now a restless murmur, a collective breathing exercise after a prolonged, suffocating fear. Thorn, Marius, and Kenji stood amongst them, the silence broken only by the drip of rainwater from the eaves of the rebuilt temple, a structure less grand than before, deliberately simplified, reflecting the village's newfound practicality. "The shard's demise," Marius said, his voice a carefully measured rumble, "was a fortunate, if unsettling, observation. The Guardian, while ancient, possessed a disturbing tendency towards self-preservation. It prolonged the nightmare for its own amusement, perhaps. This encounter demonstrated a crucial element: the disruptor's efficacy isn't solely about technological superiority. It's about forcing a confrontation with the corruption." Kenji remained silent, his hand resting on the hilt of Winter's breath. The blade felt heavier now, not with the weight of accumulated battles, but with the accumulated weight of knowledge, a terrifying understanding of the cyclical nature of darkness. The vision Head experienced in the chamber hadn't been a random projection, but a carefully constructed echo, a fragment of his own potential demise. Had seen the boy he once was, a flicker of lost idealism drowned in the red tide of despair, a mirror reflecting the very thing he was now tasked with combating. "We focused on the external manifestation," Thorn added, his usual brisk efficiency tempered by a thoughtful frown. "The Oni, the obsidian, the corrupted earth." But the Guardian was highlighting a truth far more insidious. The Oni weren't merely creatures of destruction, they were drawn to suffering, to the concentrated pools of sorrow that permeated this land. Winter's breath. It wasn't just a blade, it was a key. He gestured to the newly formed clearing at the edge of the village, where the villagers were slowly beginning to clear the residue of the battle. Not just the shattered obsidian, but something darker, something clinging to the earth like a festering wound. They were using simple tools, shovels, brushes, even carefully placed stones, to disrupt the soil, to expose it to the weak, returning sunlight. The disruption, Thorn continued, wasn't about obliterating the entity, it was about disrupting the croissant disruptee. Kenji nodded, observing the villagers. They weren't wielding swords or magic. They were simply working, a quiet, deliberate act of defiance against a force that thrived on hopelessness. He recognized a similar tactic in the old stories, the Buddhist principle of metta, or loving kindness, channeled not through prayers, but through action. It was a subtle shift, a profound understanding that the most potent weapon against darkness wasn't brute force, but the willingness to meet it with compassion. "The Red Crag," Kenji said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of conviction, "doesn't seek to destroy. It seeks to consume, to drown the world in its own reflection." He drew Winter's breath, the silver light catching the rain-slicked stone. "And this isn't a battle of steel and sorcery. It's a battle of wills." He spent the next hour working alongside the villagers, demonstrating a technique Head learned from a forgotten master, a slow, deliberate pattern of circling the affected area, a rhythmic application of pressure with the blade, not to harm, but to do. It was a silent exchange, a communion between a hardened warrior and a community grappling with a nightmare they barely understood. As the last of the dark residue was cleared, a strange stillness settled over Oakhaven. The rain stopped, and a sliver of sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the village in a pale, ethereal glow. "We've done little, I realize," Elder Silas spoke, his voice raspy with age, "but we've changed something. The fear, it's not gone entirely, but it's quieter, less consuming." Kenji lowered Winter's breath, the reflection in the blade now showing not just the village, but a glimmer of something akin to hope. "The darkness will always return," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks, "but so too will the light. It simply requires tending." He paused, a shadow passing over his face. "I must leave," he said, his voice carrying a profound sadness. "I have seen the path, and it is a lonely one." Thorn stepped forward, offering a simple hand-woven scarf, the color of twilight. "We will not forget what Yuve taught us, Kenji-san. Nor will we allow the darkness to consume us again." Kenji accepted the offering, his fingers brushing against Thorn's. It was a fleeting connection, a shared acknowledgement of the burden they now carried. He turned to leave, and as he did, he offered a final cryptic observation: the greatest darkness isn't born in the shadows, but in the hearts of men. And the greatest light isn't found in grand gestures, but in the smallest acts of kindness. With a final silent nod, Kenji vanished over the crest of the hill, a silver ghost dissolving back into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of Winter's breath and the quiet, determined rhythm of a village beginning to understand the true nature of its fight. The village of Oakhaven, no longer simply surviving, was learning to live with its shadow. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Stone. The rain began subtly, a fine, persistent drizzle that clung to the slate roofs of Oakhaven and deepened the gray of the stone walls. It wasn't the violent, cleansing rain of a storm. It was the rain of regret, of unspoken anxieties, and of the slow, inevitable erosion of memory. Kenji hadn't intended to linger, but the rain, and the quiet persistence of the villagers, had held him. He found Thorn tending the newly cleared space where the shogun had fallen, carefully gathering the remnants of ash, and meticulously arranging smooth, gray stones to mark the spot. The elder Silas was there too, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to seep from the very stone he sat upon. "You were right, Kenji-san," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "The darkness, it isn't a monster to be slain with steel alone. It's a sickness, a festering wound that needs to be cauterized with something other than violence." Kenji observed him, a profound sadness settling over him. "Violence, wielded carelessly, simply fuels the flames. It becomes the darkness itself." There was a moment of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal, often futile, nature of their confrontation. The villagers hadn't celebrated victory, they had recognized a shift, a subtle but crucial alteration in their own perception. They were no longer victims defined solely by terror. They were survivors, armed with a newfound awareness, a terrifying understanding of the forces at play. Thorn broke the silence. "We have begun to build a ward, Kenji-san. A circle of stones, imbued with with things we don't fully understand, things passed down through generations. It's crude, perhaps, but it feels grounding. A tangible defense against the influence." He gestured to the growing ring of stones, each carefully placed, each radiating a faint, cool energy. "The village priestess, Lyra, says it's a channeling of the land spirit, a strengthening of the connection to this place." Kenji examined the circle, noting the intricate patterns carved into the stone spirals, intersecting lines, and unsettling geometric shapes that seemed to shift slightly in the rain. He saw not just an attempt at protection, but an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to succumb to the despair that had choked Oakhaven for decades. "The greatest darkness isn't born in the shadows," he repeated, the words carrying a weight he hadn't intended them to, "but in the hearts of men." And the greatest light isn't found in grand gestures, but in the smallest acts of kindness. He realized, with a sharp, poignant clarity, that his words hadn't simply been an observation, they were a directive. Silas nodded slowly. We are beginning to understand. We've instituted a system of vigilance, rotating watches, maintaining open fires, offering small tokens of respect to the spirits of the land. It's awkward, certainly, but it feels honest. The rain intensified, drumming a steady rhythm on the stone. The villagers had begun to carry themselves differently, not with the frantic fear of the past, but with a quiet resolve, a measured awareness. They spoke of a shared responsibility, a burden they were willing to bear. Suddenly, a young boy, 8 or 9 years old, appeared, breathless and clutching a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Kenji-san, I found this near the old shrine. It was cold. It felt like it was watching me. Kenji took the bird, examining its delicate features. It was clearly a relic, imbued with a lingering trace of the darkness. He didn't incinerate it as he might have done before, driven by instinct. Instead, he placed it gently amongst the stones of the ward, anchoring it within the burgeoning circle. The fear, it's not gone entirely, he said, his voice low. But it's quieter, less consuming. He looked at the villagers, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fires, a tentative hope mirrored in their eyes. This circle, it's not a prison. It's a conduit, a way to channel the darkness, to understand it, to tame it. As he spoke, a tremor ran through the earth, a subtle vibration that resonated deep within his bones. He felt a pull, a faint whisper of something ancient and malevolent stirring within the heart of the ward. It was a fleeting sensation, quickly suppressed, but it served as a stark reminder the darkness wasn't gone. It was merely dormant, waiting for the slightest lapse in vigilance, the smallest act of arrogance. Kenji knew his time was drawing to a close. The need to leave, the echo of his own loneliness, pressed upon him with renewed force. He turned to Thorn, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Tend to this place, Thorn. Let the stone remember. Let the rain wash away the residue." He began to walk, melting back into the mist, a silver ghost dissolving into the gray, his footsteps swallowed by the rain, leaving behind only the silent, resolute rhythm of a village learning to live with its shadow, and the unsettling echo of a lone Ronin's final, cryptic observation. Chapter 12. The Stone Remembers the Rain continued its relentless drumming against Oakhaven, a mournful counterpoint to the quiet hum of the ward. It wasn't a celebratory rain washing away the taint of demonic influence, but a weary rain, a constant reminder of the struggle beneath the surface. Kenji, as Thorn had observed, was already fading, a spectral presence woven into the very fabric of the village. He moved with a deliberate stillness, his silvered armor catching the muted light, almost a reflection of the twilight head so effectively banished. He found Thorn meticulously adjusting the placement of a newly discovered, lichen-covered stone within the ward's foundation. The stone, unearthed during the frantic digging after the Shogun's fall, pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence, a lingering echo of the demon's power. "You're listening to it, aren't you?" Kenji asked, his voice a low rasp, weathered by countless battles and perhaps a lifetime of regret. Thorn didn't startle, simply nodded, his face grim. "The stone speaks of cycles, Master Kenji, of the Red Crag's hunger. It's a stubborn whisper, but persistent." Kenji approached, examining the stone with a practiced eye. "The key isn't to silence it, Thorn. Silence breeds resentment. The darkness doesn't fight to be ignored, it seeks an outlet, a vessel." He ran a calloused hand over the cool, damp surface. Understanding is the only true weapon. The villagers, drawn by the quiet intensity of the exchange, gathered around the ward. There was a palpable tension in the air, not of fear, but of profound contemplation. They had witnessed the impossible, the annihilation of a creature born of nightmare, and now, faced with the unsettling reality of the darkness' lingering presence, they sought to comprehend its nature. Elder Zealous, his face etched with the burden of leadership, stepped forward. "You spoke of a conduit, Master Kenji, a way to channel the darkness. But what of control? Will we simply invite it back with every attempt?" Kenji paused, his gaze sweeping across the worried faces. He didn't offer a simple reassurance. Control isn't about dominance, Elder. It's about recognition. The darkness isn't an enemy to be crushed, but a force to be acknowledged, contained within a framework of discipline and respect. He paused, a flicker of something akin to sadness in his eyes. Respect for the void. It reflects our own fears, our own weaknesses. To deny that is to invite it to fester. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The concept was unsettling, a delicate balance between acceptance and vigilance. It was a far cry from the primal instinct of destruction they'd initially possessed, fueled by the terror of the Oni. "The rain," Kenji continued, his voice barely audible above the drumming on the stone. "It washes away more than just dirt, doesn't it? It washes away echoes. The earth remembers, Thorn. Let the stone remember. Let the rain wash away the residue." He turned to leave, but Thorn stopped him. "Master Kenji, you've been withdrawn lately. Is this your farewell?" Kenji didn't turn. A samurai doesn't say goodbye, Thorn. He simply fades into the next dawn. He took a step, then another, melting into the mist that clung to the valley floor. "There's a comfort in the inevitable, you know. The knowledge that even the most ferocious storm eventually subsides." As he walked, a strange tremor ran through him, a deeper resonance than the subtle vibration had felt earlier. It wasn't a threat, not precisely, but a profound sense of completion. He was shedding the weight of a life lived in shadow, returning to the stillness from which had emerged. Thorn watched him go, the flickering light of the fires casting an elongated, distorted silhouette against the rain-soaked stone. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the loneliness inherent in Kenji's journey. The warrior, forged in a crucible of violence and loss, was returning to an emptiness he couldn't fill. He knelt beside the stone, tracing the patterns of lichen with his fingers. He could almost feel Kenji's presence, a faint echo of a silver blade and a weathered soul. Suddenly, he noticed something. Embedded within the stones, luminescence was a miniature image, a stylized depiction of the Red Crag, not as a monstrous demon, but as a towering mountain, shrouded in mist. And within the mist, a single, perfect silver blade. He realized with a chilling clarity that Kenji hadn't simply defeated the darkness, had absorbed a piece of it, a fragment of the void itself. And now, that fragment, nestled within the stone, was quietly waiting to be awakened. The stone remembered, and in its remembering, it subtly amplified the unsettling rhythm of the ward, a constant, almost imperceptible reminder that the fight wasn't truly over. It simply transformed from a battle against demons to a delicate, eternal negotiation with a shadow within the stone and within themselves. Chapter 13. Echoes of the Crag. The rain intensified, a relentless gray curtain that seemed to seep into the very bones of Oakhaven. Thorn hadn't slept, hadn't truly rested since Kenji's departure. The miniature image within the stone had become an obsession, a cold, unsettling counterpoint to the burgeoning warmth of the village's renewed life. Had spent the hours meticulously examining the stone, rotating it under the flickering lamplight, trying to understand the significance of the shifting luminescence, the subtly altered rhythm of the ward. It wasn't a sound he could consciously register, not a bell or chime, but a vibration, a resonance felt more in the marrow of his bones, than in his ears. The elders, preoccupied with celebrating the village's salvation, seemed oblivious to his concerns. They lauded Kenji's bravery, his skill, his selfless dedication. But their words felt hollow, as if they were trying to grasp at smoke. They hadn't witnessed the raw, chilling truth head unearthed. They hadn't understood the insidious nature of the power Kenji had confronted, nor the unsettling way it was now manifesting within the stone. Thorn felt a creeping dread, a sensation that sharpened with each passing moment. The stone's luminescence was growing brighter, pulsating with a deeper, more frantic rhythm. The image of the Red Crag, once a stark, brutal representation of demonic might, seemed to shift, to subtly deform. The mist within the stylized mountain began to coalesce, taking on a denser, more defined form. It wasn't just a visual alteration, it felt like a deepening of the air, a subtle pressure against his chest. He consulted the ancient texts, bound in cracked leather and filled with indecipherable script. The warding rituals, passed down through generations, spoke of containing the Oni, of disrupting their connection to the mortal realm. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, about absorbing a fragment of the void, about the insidious influence of the shadow itself. The texts were filled with warnings about aggression, about channeling righteous fury, but they offered no guidance on how to deal with a force born not of malice, but of an ancient, unsettling emptiness. A chilling realization dawned on him. Kenji hadn't merely defeated the shogun, had become a conduit, a vessel for the crag's power. The silver blade hadn't just cut through darkness, it had absorbed it, feeding the core of the stone's resonance. The fight wasn't over, it had merely shifted its form. He rose from his kneeling position, the damp stone cold beneath his fingertips. The village, vibrant with restored life, felt suddenly fragile, like a delicate porcelain doll teetering on the edge of a table. He needed to understand the mechanics of this transformation, to anticipate the consequences of Kenji's actions. As he moved through the narrow, rain-slicked streets, he noticed subtle changes. The villagers, previously bustling with activity, seemed subdued, almost hesitant. Their laughter had faded, their conversations muted. He observed a young boy, no older than 8, staring intently at the stone in the center of the square, his brow furrowed in a strange, unnerving concentration. He approached cautiously, speaking in a low voice. "What troubles you, child?" The boy didn't respond, simply continued to stare, his eyes glazed over. Thorn knelt beside him, reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. As his fingers brushed against the boy's skin, he felt it, a fleeting, icy sensation, a momentary disturbance in the ward's rhythm. "The stone, it shows me something," the boy finally whispered, his voice hollow and distant. "A mountain, a blade, and a reflection of myself." Thorn's blood ran cold. The boy wasn't merely observing the stone's image, he was experiencing its influence, the unsettling echo of the crag's essence. The stone wasn't just remembering, it was imprinting. He knew then that Kenji hadn't simply left Oakhaven behind, had left a seed, a dormant fragment of the void, waiting to bloom within the collective unconscious of the village. The shift in the ward was not a warning, it was an invitation. As the first streaks of dawn began to pierce the oppressive gray, Thorn knew he couldn't continue to ignore the unsettling truth. He had to find Kenji, to understand the extent of the damage, to find a way to sever the connection before it consumed them all. But he also realized with a terrifying certainty that the fight had become far more complex than he could have imagined. It wasn't a battle against demons. It was a battle against the very nature of existence, against the seductive allure of emptiness, and the chilling possibility that the greatest darkness resided not in the shadow, but within the light. Chapter 14. Echoes in Stone. The gray of dawn wasn't the gentle wash Thorn had expected. It was a bruised, sickly hue, clinging to the rain-slicked cobblestones of Oakhaven like a reluctant shroud. The scent of wood smoke, once a comforting reminder of resilience, now carried a metallic tang, a ghost of the battle he hadn't realized had been fighting. The silence, once oppressive, was now punctuated by a low, almost subsonic hum, emanating, Thorn suspected, from the ward itself, the intricately carved basalt monolith that had, for generations, guarded the village from the incursions of the Red Crag. He found Kenji not on the horizon as had feared, but nestled amongst the crumbling ruins of the old shrine, a place forgotten even by the villagers. The setting sun had bled its last vestiges of light, leaving the shrine steeped in an unsettling violet. Kenji was sitting cross-legged on the moss-covered stones, meticulously cleaning Winter's breath. The silver of the blade reflected the gloom, a disconcerting mimicry of the demons had vanquished. "You've been quiet," Thorn said, his voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the churning anxiety within. Kenji didn't look up. "Quietude has its own value," he replied, his voice a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering across stone, especially when surrounded by echoes. Thorn knelt beside him, the damp stone chilling through his trousers. The ward, it shifted. It wasn't merely a response to the demons. It resonated. Kenji finally raised his head, his eyes, the color of polished steel, devoid of the usual guardedness. "You felt it too, then. The ripple, the invitation." He gestured to the blade with a deliberate movement. "The crag doesn't simply take. It seeks. It probes. It delights in the unraveling of things." "What exactly were you doing here, Kenji?" Thorn pressed, the question laced with a growing dread. Had spent the last 24 hours wrestling with the unsettling implications of the boy's encounter with the stone, trying to decipher the truth behind Thorn's increasingly cryptic pronouncements. Kenji sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "I was preparing. A blade doesn't simply sever a tether, it needs to be honed, sharpened, imbued with purpose." The Shogun was a particularly tenacious piece of the void. It clung to the remnants of his power, feeding on despair and regret. To truly destroy it, one must not just cut, but understand the source of its hunger. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the ruined shrine, as if searching for something beyond the physical. "The stone, it showed me more than just a reflection. It showed me a need, a terrible, gnawing need for balance. The crag's influence isn't just a brute force of destruction. It's a corruption of order, a twisting of the natural flow. It thrives on discord, on the unresolved conflicts within a place, within a person." Thorn felt a prickle of unease. This was far beyond the simplistic narrative of a lone warrior battling demonic hordes. Kenji was speaking of something far more profound, far more terrifying, a fundamental imbalance within the very fabric of reality. "And you believe you can fix this?" Kenji chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Fix? No, tithe. Not fix. Contain. Redirect. Dot. The crag doesn't vanish with a single blow. It simply retreats, seeking another vessel, another point of vulnerability." The ward was a flawed defense. It was a reactive measure, not a preventative one. The real battle isn't against monsters, Thorn. It's against the silence, the emptiness that breeds them. He looked up at Thorn, his steel-gray eyes piercing. "You sensed the connection, didn't you? The boy, he wasn't just experiencing the stone's influence. He was offering it a conduit, an opening." Thorn realized, with a sickening certainty, that Kenji hadn't merely left Oakhaven behind, had deliberately seeded the village with the potential for the crag's return. "Why?" he asked, the question a desperate plea for understanding. "Because," Kenji said, returning his attention to the meticulous cleaning of Winter's breath, "sometimes the only way to fight darkness is to invite it in, to force it to confront itself, to make it." The subsonic hum of the ward intensified, a low throb that seemed to resonate within Thorn's very bones. He looked down at the boy, who was now staring intently at the stone, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. The boy's glazed eyes had sharpened, reflecting the violet light with an unnerving clarity. Thorn understood with chilling clarity that the fight had only just begun. It wasn't about defeating a demon. It was about wrestling with the terrifying implications of choice, of intention, of the unsettling possibility that humanity itself was the greatest weapon in the Crag's arsenal. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Chapter 15. The Architect of Shadows. The rain began subtly, a fine, insistent drizzle that mirrored the unsettling precision of Kenji's movements. He worked with a reverence usually reserved for the highest temples, painstakingly polishing winter's breath, the silver blade gleaming with an almost predatory light. Thorn watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. The subsonic thrum of the ward a constant nagging reminder of the precariousness of their situation. "You believe him, then?" Thorn finally asked, breaking the silence that had become a suffocating presence. "That he orchestrated this? Deliberately invited the Crag's return?" Kenji paused, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up, simply continued to refine the edge of the katana with a practiced hand. "Observation is not belief, Thorn. I observed a pattern. Decades of fear, of a village built on denial, have created a receptive soil. The Oni of the Red Crag don't simply descend, they are. And sometimes, the most effective summons are the most subtle." He finally raised his gaze, his eyes the color of weathered steel, holding a disconcerting depth. The village elders, clinging to their traditions, their superstitions, had woven a narrative of helplessness. They provided a narrative for the darkness, and the darkness readily embraced it. This boy, he wasn't an unwitting victim. He was a catalyst. A flawed, exquisitely crafted one, but a catalyst nonetheless. Thorn shifted uncomfortably, the damp stone of the observation chamber clinging to his boots. The boy, Elias, was a disturbing focal point. His unnatural stillness radiating a quiet, unnerving intelligence. The violet luminescence within his eyes seemed to pulse with a growing awareness, an understanding that felt profoundly unsettling. "You're suggesting," Thorn said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "that he was feeding it, nourishing the void." "Not nourishing precisely," Kenji corrected, his voice low and measured. "More like offering a framework, a structure. The darkness is, at its core, a negation of form, of order. It thrives on chaos, on the absence of meaning. By subtly altering the villagers' perceptions, by amplifying their fears and anxieties, by creating a vacuum of resistance, the boy provided the initial vectors for the Crag's influence to take root." The hum of the ward intensified, rising in pitch, as if responding to Kenji's deductions. Thorn felt a physical strain, a tightening in his temples. And the Shogun, the Great Horned One? He was a manifestation of that influence, a particularly potent echo-given form? "A projection," Kenji confirmed, resuming his meticulous cleaning. "A focusing point. The Crag doesn't simply send monsters, it harnesses existing vulnerabilities, amplifies them. The villagers' fear, their unspoken guilt, their unresolved grief, they were the raw materials. The Shogun was the architect, constructing a temporary fortress of dread within Oakhaven." Thorn felt a chilling realization dawn upon him. "You weren't trying to the Oni. You were trying to them. To manipulate the darkness itself." Kenji finally laid down the katana, studying it with a quiet intensity. "Control isn't about suppression, Thorn. It's about understanding. It's about guiding a force, shaping its expression. The Oni of the Red Crag aren't driven by malice, not in the way we understand it. They are echoes of a primal urge, a fundamental rejection of order. By confronting them with their own distorted reflection, by forcing them to act within a framework of our design, we diminish their power. We deny them the fuel they need to grow. He paused, his gaze meeting Thorn's directly. You see monsters, Thorn? I see a reflection. And reflections, if manipulated correctly, can be extraordinarily useful. The raining intensified, now a steady, mournful cascade against the stone walls. Thorn turned his attention back to Elias, who was no longer simply staring at the stone, but tracing patterns in the air with a deliberate, almost ritualistic motion. The violet light in his eyes had deepened, and for a fleeting moment, Thorn thought he saw something within them, a flicker of amusement, of terrifying knowledge. The ward, Thorn said, his voice strained. It's becoming unstable. The boy's connection, it's strengthening. Kenji nodded, his expression grim. The invitation has been accepted. Now we must determine the terms of the exchange. He picked up Winter's breath, testing its balance in his hand. The darkness doesn't fight. It adapts. And sometimes, Thorn, the greatest defense is not strength, but the willingness to understand the architect of your own despair. He stepped towards the boy, Winter's breath raised, a silver sentinel poised to confront a darkness not born of battle, but of deliberate, unsettling design. The violet light pulsed brighter, and Thorn knew, with a sickening certainty, that the true war had only just begun, a war against not just monsters, but against the insidious architecture of the void itself.